Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are privileged to start a new book. And even though, according to the traditional order of the books of the prophets, after the study of Jeremiah, which we all just completed together, the next logical book would be that of Ezekiel. However, I am choosing to study the book of Daniel. The reason why I choose this, to be honest, Ezekiel is a long book, and Jeremiah was very long, and I wanted to pick something a little bit shorter. Daniel will still take us a nice bit of time. There's a lot in it. It's not super short, but it's a lot shorter than Ezekiel. But also, more importantly than that, I am choosing Daniel because of the chronology. We spent a lot of time studying Jeremiah about the final days of the Judean Empire and the fall of the Judean kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians. We learned about how during the kingdom of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, how he rebelled against Babylon, and that Babylon came and attacked and took Jehoiakim's successor, Jehoiachin, into exile, and many other of the prominent Jewish people from the land of Judea with him into exile, but he allowed a vassal king Tzidkiyahu to remain in place and the temple to remain in place until they rebelled again, and then he attacked again. Since the story of Daniel is the story of one of those individuals who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar during his first attack against Judea, and the story of how Daniel became adjusted to living as a Jew in exile in Babylonia, I thought it would be fitting to follow the book of Jeremiah with the book of Daniel. But as we go through this, I might reference this several more times. The question as to the authorship of Daniel, of the book, is out there. There's a lot of scholarly discussion regarding this. The Jewish tradition has it that the book of Daniel was assembled into its current form during the days of what is known as the Men of the Great Assembly. The Men of the Great Assembly are the rabbis who led the Jewish people from the time of the late Babylonian exile, just prior to the building of the Second Temple, for some 250 to 300 years or so into the period of the Second Temple, after which began the rule after which the Men of the Great Assembly dispersed. The remainder, the last one of which we know as Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the high priests, Simon the Righteous, who lived somewhere around 250 to 300 BCE, would have been the end of that period. So during that period of time, which is a long period of time, when the Men of the Great Assembly were the religious and spiritual leaders of the people, this is when the book of Daniel was assembled. So therefore, according to our tradition, it wasn't actually necessarily written word for word from beginning to end by Daniel himself, although parts of it are written by him, parts of it might have been written about him, parts of it might have been students or those that learned from him that wrote down the teachings and the stories and happenings of Daniel, and then it became assembled in its current form several hundred years later. Regardless, this is, according to tradition, this is the book that tells us the story of Daniel, many important teachings of Daniel, many important prophecies of his. And another thing to know from our tradition is that Daniel is considered a lesser level prophet. In other words, he's not one who spoke directly to God, but did receive visions from God, and so on. All that aside, this story is a beautiful one, and there are many deliberate parallels between the story of Daniel and the biblical story of Joseph. As we read through them, they'll become extremely obvious. Both were young men that were taken away from home against their will and brought to a new country. Both eventually became adopted into the household and the audience of the king, and both eventually achieved high levels in the king's government, and both were known to be very handsome, good-looking. They were both known to have incredible interpersonal skills and abilities to understand how to talk to other people and how to get along with others and earn their respect and honor. And both had the unique ability to interpret the dreams of others. The ability to interpret dreams is a unique, special one, which can be presented as a spiritual or something above and beyond normal human understanding, something that comes directly from God. But we also know that the ability to interpret the dreams of others is really about the ability to understand other people, to understand what drives them, to understand what's meaningful to them, to understand the way that person looks at the world, interprets the world, looks at themselves, interprets themselves, and then take those visions and understand and appreciate what their dreams mean and what they are, and relate it back to them in a way that makes sense to them. And both Joseph and Daniel possess this unique ability. After this brief introduction, let's get on with the study of the first chapter of Daniel. Bishnat Shalosh L'Malchut Yehoyakim in Melech Yehuda, during the third year of the reign of the kingdom of Yehoyakim, the king of Judah, Bad Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel Yerushalayim. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem by Yatzar Allah, and he laid siege to it. I am really not going to spend a lot of time dealing with the chronologies, because from other places it would seem that it was really in the fourth year of Yehoiakim's reign, not in the third year, and there's other discrepancies of dates which are even bigger than this one. There's commentaries upon commentaries upon commentaries that try to explain why there is this discrepancy. I'm not going to go into that. To me, the story, the teachings are what's important. The historical context is important to the extent that it helps us understand what is meaningful about the story and what we can learn from it. Those bits of meaning are in the text themselves, and we can draw them out from the text themselves. So forgive me if I don't spend a long time delving into discrepancies such as dates and things like that. Verse 2, Vayitain Adonai biyado, and God put in his hand, in other words, he conquered, at Yehoyakim Melech Yehuda, Yehoyakim the king of Judah, Umiktzat klei Beit Elohim, and some of the vessels of the house of God, of the temple, Vayivi'em Eretz Shinar Beit Elohav, and he brought them back to the land of Shinar. Shinar is an ancient name for the land which is now occupied by the kingdom of Babylon, to the house of his God. Ve'etakelim, excuse me, and the vessels that he had taken from the holy temple, he took Beit Otzar Elohav to this treasury of his God as captive booty. Vayomer HaMelech LaAshpenaz Rab Sorisov. Now he has all these captives that he just brought back from Judea, and as was common custom among conquering nations in those days, he did the following. He told the man named Ashpenaz, who was the head of his Sarisim. The word Saris literally means eunuch, but over time, and because eunuchs were generally appointed as loyal assistants, officers of the king. However, over time, the word Saris evolved from meaning a eunuch to meaning just a high officer in the king's house that may or may not have actually been a eunuch. So I'm just going to translate Rav Sarisov, the head of his officers. Whether or not this man was actually a eunuch is not really relevant to the story. So he asked him to do the following: La'avimi b'nei Yisrael mizera ha'melucha amin apartimim. I want you to bring me of these new captives we just got back from Judea. Bring me some of the young men, some of the children of the noble families, some of the nobility. Bring them to me, because I want to train them in my ways. We can indoctrinate them in the ways of Babylon and make them a part of my household and a part of my government. And specifically, I want people that fit the following description, as in verse 4, Yeladim asher ein bohem kolmum, young men, boys. He didn't want older men that have already, grown in the ways of Judea, and he wants to be able to raise them as Babylonians. So young boys that do not have any physical blemishes, v'tovei mara, they should be good in appearance, handsome. Umaskilim b'chol chachma, they should be very smart in all kinds of wisdom. V'yodei da'as u'mevinei mada, they should understand knowledge, or they should know a lot of knowledge. Yodei da'as is with knowledge of things, of facts. U'mevinei mada, and they should also understand. I'm going to translate mada as science, even though what we conceive of today as science is not the same thing as what they would have conceived it of then, but they understand knowledge, they understand how things work in the world. And also they should be physically strong. They should also have the strength to stand in the king's presence. The king's officers would have to stand by the throne throughout the day and stand for long periods of time. They need to be physically strong in order to do that. Ulilamdam sefer, I want you to teach them all of the book knowledge, ulashon kastim, and the language of the Chaldeans, which is nowadays known as cuneiform writing. We know there's thousands upon thousands of tablets that have been excavated and discovered, and they're scattered across museums around the world, written in the language of the Chaldeans, which is a complex language, but one in which much history and much knowledge was recorded. I want you to teach them this language so that they know it and that they understand it. And the king set aside for them daily rations, mi patbag hamelach, from the patbag. Bag is a Babylonian word that we don't really know what it means. Pat is a portion, usually refers to a portion of bread, but patbag is a portion of a meal. From the king's meals, and a portion of the wine from which the king used to drink, so it was quality wine. And to raise them for 3 years, and from them it will be obvious who the stars are, who the outstanding ones are, and they will be then appointed to stand before the king to serve the king. So we'll make sure they have good food, good wine, the training and study and learning. They'll know how to read and write, and these are the ones that will stand in front of me to serve me. And among these children that were taken were sons of Judah, in other words, Judeans from the tribe of Judah. The following 4 young men: Daniel, one by the name of Daniel; Hananiah, one by the name of Hananiah; Mishael, Azariah, and Azariah. Those are the 4 boys of Judah that were taken among these young men to be trained in this manner. Vayasem lahem sar hasarisim shemos. The first thing he did, of course, was give them Babylonian names. These Hebrew names, these Jewish names, those aren't good names for someone who's going to be in the Babylonian court. We have to give them Babylonian names. Vayasem le Daniel Belshazzar. He named Daniel Belshazzar, within which Baal is one of the names of the Babylonian gods. Vilchananya Shadrach. He called him Shadrach. Umishael Meshach. Azariah Aved Nego. He called him Aved, the servant of Nego. So they had foreign names with names of foreign gods mixed into their names, given to them good Babylonian names for young men that are now going to be trained to be good Babylonian officers and officials. However, this food presumably contained meat and other foods which were not kosher. And here we see the first challenge recorded of a Judean being sent into exile and being asked not only to change his name and his language, but also to start eating food which would otherwise have been prohibited to him. food which is not kosher, food which was not slaughtered properly, not prepared properly, or possibly even food from animals that are not considered kosher for a Jewish young man to eat. And here we see the challenge of how do we now live when we're not in our own country anymore. Now, and even worse case in his scenario, he wasn't even in his own home, he was in the home of the king. He didn't have a choice. So he had several choices. He could say, well, I don't have a choice, I'm forced to do it, I have to do it, what could I do? But Daniel was smart, and he said, without endangering my life, maybe I can figure out a way around this, figure out a way to maintain my values, my way of life, and my religious beliefs, even under these circumstances. That's why it says in verse 8, Vayosem Daniel alibo. And Daniel made it clear in his heart. He said to himself, Asher lo yitka al bepatpag hamelach uviyein mishtav. I do not want to be defiled. I don't want my body to be defiled with this king's food or the wine that the king drank. Now this wine was clearly wine that was used and made and fermented for the purpose of serving the gods of Babylon and as parts of parties and worship that were for the gods of Babylon, which would have meant that this wine is prohibited as well. So he made up his mind not to, but now he just had to figure out a plan. So the first thing he did was he asked permission. He goes to the chief officer who's in charge of training the young men and said, I don't want to eat this food. Let me have my own food. And because Daniel was a person who presented himself in such a charming way, and he knew how to speak with people, Vayiteinu Elohim et Daniel, this sounds so familiar to what we find with Joseph. Daniel God placed Daniel in front of him l'chesed l'rachamim, in a way that he gained kindness and mercy l'fnei sarisim, from before the chief officer. In other words, rather than blow up and be angry, he saw that Daniel was sincere and honest, and he was well disposed towards Daniel, wanting to grant him his favor. However, Vayomer Sarisim Daniel, Sarisim was still honest with Daniel. He said, Yareani et Adoni HaMelech, I am afraid of my master the king. Asher mino et ma'achalchem et mishtechem, he set aside your food portions and your drink portions because he wanted you to grow and be healthy and strong. Asher lama yirat pneichem zoafim, why would it be that he's going to end up, how could I allow it that he'll end up seeing your faces weak and tired and not well nourished? If you don't eat this food, less you're going to look unhealthier than normal men your age. And the king is going to assume that I'm not taking care of you, maybe that I'm even stealing the food for myself and not giving you proper food, and I'll end up being beheaded. My life will be in jeopardy. It's my job to make sure that you have healthy food. So Daniel is a smart young man, and he realizes that he can't, the Saras or Isim, the head officer in charge of them, can't officially do anything. But sometimes there's ways, hint, hint, wink, wink, that you can find the Saras or Isim can't put himself in danger. But the Saras or Isim, the head master, appointed a cook, a chef, to prepare the food for the young men and to actually feed them. And Daniel thought, well, maybe I could make a deal on this side. So instead of going to the chief, Daniel went El HaMeltzar, Vayomer Daniel El HaMeltzar, which in modern Hebrew means a waiter. In this context, it seems like more the one that the chief officer made in charge of actually distributing the food. The chief officer being in charge of all the training, of the learning, and so he probably had to hire special teachers to teach how to write, to teach how to read, to teach certain disciplines and subject matter, and also somebody to be in charge of the food. So Daniel went to him, the one who was in charge, Al Daniel Hanani Mishal Vazaria, over those 4 young men. And he said, Nasno esnavadacha yamim asara, test out your servants for 10 days. V'yidnu lanu min hazeroim, give us from the vegetables, from the Some translate this as legumes, as beans, which would be a nice, good source of vegetable protein. V'nochla, and we'll eat that. Umayim, and we just need water, v'nishter, and we could drink that. We don't need wine. We don't need this fancy meat. Just give us salad, vegetables, beans. Try it out for 10 days. The king's not going to see us for a while. 10 days you can try it out. And then you'll see after 10 days how healthy we are. And how the other boys that are eating the king's portions, let's see who looks healthier. And you'll see if we look as healthy as them, or if they look healthier than us, then you can decide the patpag. And he listened to this idea. And he tested them out for 10 days to see what would happen. The verse 15, and when these 10 days were up, Niram Mariam Tov, they looked very good. They looked fine and healthy. Uvriye Basar, Min Kol Hayeladim, even healthier. And Briye Basar, it was a thing that looked even fatter. Not fat in an unhealthy sense, but fatter meaning their bodies looked filled out. More than all the other children who were eating the portions of the king. So, Daniel, of course, was smart enough to orchestrate it in such a way that there was something in it for this waiter, for this chef. So, so now, the food was still being given to this waiter to feed the boys. He would take home all this extra meat and wine to his family and enjoy the good food, those portions that were meant for the boys, and he would get away with feeding these boys just seeds and beans, anything that's planted, vegetables, fruits, so on. So the young men were vegetarians, and the rest of them ate meat. This is, this would be definitely a supportive argument for the health value of eating fruits and vegetables and the fruit of the ground, and not eating daily meat, and also for avoiding the high contents of alcohol that the other kids would have been consuming in the wine. Verse 17, now these 4 boys that were now growing up in this environment of training, Nasan lohem Elohim, God gave them madov v'haskel b'chol sefer v'chachma. Literally that means knowledge and proficiency in all of the books and all of the wisdom. So the Daniel and his 3 friends had now gained lots and lots of knowledge. They were able to read and write. They were able to speak the language of the Babylonians. They were able to study through all of the books and gain all kinds of knowledge about the world, about history, about whatever they knew of the natural sciences in those days. And they became extremely wise in all these areas. However, Daniel had something above and beyond that. Not only did he know all of this and know all of this science, but Daniel Hevin b'chol chazon v'chalamot. He even understood more. He understood visions and dreams. Now, most of the commentaries assume that this means that he had spiritual knowledge of God, and that this was the knowledge of the divine spirit, or the knowledge of prophecy, which he had achieved, but not the other 3 young men. And it does mean that, to the extent that understanding chazon v'chalamot, people's dreams and visions, does come from that faith, that special relationship that Daniel had and understood with his God, that he did not abandon, even though he was now stuck in this foreign, alien environment. However, I'm going to posit and state that I think that this Daniel Havin, his understanding, really means something really more than that. It's more than divine knowledge. How could that possibly be? What do I mean by more than divine knowledge? A person who really, you can have a scientist that knows all of the science, but he doesn't get it. He doesn't get how it works with people, how to apply it to real relationships, how to look at another person and understand what it is that makes that person tick, what it is that that person needs, wants, looks for, understands, thinks, dreams about. Clearly, dreams about is important. Daniel was one who was able to understand that. And we're going to see over and over again throughout this book how this special, unique skill of Daniel was put in place. So we've already seen it. Daniel understood how to manipulate the system in order to get what he did in a way that everybody liked him. He was able to present himself to the chief officer when he realized that wasn't the way to get away with it. Then he struck a deal with the Meltzar, with the chef, which was a win-win situation deal where no one's going to get in trouble and everybody gains. He knew how to use people's dreams, to use people's visions, to use people's needs and desires in order to make sure that everyone is happy and that he was able to continue in his quest to be a better person. Let's look at verse 18. And when the time had come, which was the 3-year period of time that the king said to bring the young men in front of the king to decide which ones will be chosen, so then the chief officer brought all of the young men before Nebuchadnezzar. The king spoke to all of them in order to determine which ones he wanted. From all of them he did not find any that was as good as these 4 young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Vayamdu lifnei HaMelech, and they were chosen to be the ones to stand in front of the king. This next verse is key, verse 20. There's various sources of knowledge. There's people that study knowledge and learn it and know it. There's people that study science and really study and really try to understand what's actually happening, from which they gain truth. It's a search for truth. When they study text to find the meaning in the text. What was the person really trying to say? What was the writer mean? What were they trying to teach? And then there's also people that resort to sorcery and magic and all sorts of trickery and really nonsense in order to come up with predictions about the future and what God supposedly is saying and wants. These young men were trained in true, real knowledge. And everything that required knowledge and understanding, that the king requested of them when the king needed advice on any particular matter, he needed to know about how to relate to a certain country, they were able to draw upon their knowledge of the history of that particular place, the topography, the geography, the kind of people, the kind of weather, or whatever it was. They had actual knowledge to draw upon to give him real advice. And he found them to be 10 times as valuable, al kol achartumim ha'ashafim, over all of the magicians and necromancers or exorcists, asher b'chol malchuto, or in all of his kingdom. The others, they would do all kinds of various ceremonies, making them seem real holy and burning incense and smoke and waving their hands and all kinds of magic. Their advice was useless. It was in comparison to the advice and the knowledge that he received from these young men who were well educated. Daniel himself became so well respected that even after this King Nebuchadnezzar, throughout the kingdom of Babylon, all the way down to the end of the kingdom, when Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, Daniel stood in the court. Vayhi Daniel ad shnatz achas l'koresh hamelach. Daniel remained in the king's court all the way to the first year of King Cyrus of Persia. That's a big jump ahead in history, but it's just saying this now to tell us how respected Daniel was of all of them, that he remained in the king's court for this king, for his son, and beyond that, all the way until the days of the Persian kingdom. And that's the end of the first chapter of Daniel. Thank you so much for studying the first chapter of Daniel together. Looking forward to studying the entire book of Daniel together, and of course beyond into the other prophets as well.